Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we're diving into part 4 of the JonBenèt Ramsey case. Last week, we covered a lot about the findings of the autopsy and the evidence that was collected. We also talked about the crime scene and some of the things that happened after JonBenèt's body was found, and then after the Ramsey family left that house for the final time. So, as always, if you haven't already, then I would highly suggest that you go back and listen to the first 3 parts of this series, or else this episode may not make a whole lot of sense to you. So, last week, we left off talking about the demands or the criteria that John and Patsy had set up in exchange for being questioned and interviewed about the death of JonBenèt. The Boulder Police Department had already kind of tried to hold JonBenèt's body for ransom, in hopes that maybe that would make John and Patsy more willing to talk to them, but obviously that did not work. So with that little recap, and without further ado, let's get it. Now, eventually, John and Patsy Ramsey did agree to be questioned by police for the first time on April 30th, 1997, but only if police would give them the printed off copy of any and all of their previous statements that they'd made to the police thus far. They also wanted to know ahead of time what questions were going to be asked, and they also wanted to be questioned together in the same room. They also had a few other, unconventional demands or stipulations that they'd set up in exchange for this interview. And my thing with this is that you would think that if your kid was murdered and you didn't have anything to do with it, then you would think that you'd want to help police find her murderer, or at least that's how I feel. I feel like I'd be at the police station 24/7, just hoping that I would remember something that may be able to help figure out who murdered my kid. But another thing that bothers me about how long it took to get this interview and this questioning done is that this interview didn't happen until 4 months after JonBenèt was murdered. That's 4 months to forget small details, 4 months to misremember something, 4 months for your brain to change the facts into fiction, because that's just something that human brains do. Our brains will change an entire memory once we start second-guessing ourselves or feeling like we're misremembering something. It's natural. But that's not what you want in a murder investigation. You'd want to get the interview and the questioning done as soon as humanly possible, so that every memory is fresh and more reliable than what it would be 4 months later. But what is so crazy about the fact that it took 4 months for police to talk to the Ramseys is that John and Patsy went on CNN and gave an interview January 1st, 1997. So just 5 days after JonBenèt's murder, John and Patsy were on CNN. But they still hadn't even talked to police about the murder yet. And during this CNN interview, you can clearly see and hear that Patsy is, presumably she's taken something. She kind of slurs her words a little and her eyes look like they're heavy and tired, like it's a struggle for her to blink. But I can also understand needing to take something to calm your mind and your body down after a tragedy like this happens. So it really wouldn't shock me if we learned that Patsy had in fact taken something that day before the CNN interview. But I don't think that anyone has ever definitively said, yes, she took this or that. That's purely speculation on my part just from watching the interviews that Patsy gave with CNN. And then once you watch other interviews, Patsy isn't slurring, her eyes don't look like they weigh a ton in any of the other videos or interviews. So while it's not really important because it doesn't change anything as far as how long it took police to finally get an interview with the Ramseys, I did at least want to mention it. But before we get into the timeline of the interviews, I wanted to go over some of the things that were found inside of the Ramsey house that the Ramsey family either claims not to know where it came from, or they claim that these items weren't theirs at all to start with. And then after that, I want to kind of talk about the interviews that were done with Burke Ramsey shortly after JonBenèt's death. But first, let's go over some of the things that were pretty strange that were found inside the Ramsey house once evidence was finally collected. So, there was a bowl of pineapples and milk left sitting out on the kitchen counter with a spoon in it. And when I say pineapples and milk, I mean that it was made in the same way that you would make a bowl of cereal. The pineapple chunks were put into a bowl and then milk was poured over top of the pineapples. And according to John and Patsy Ramsey, pineapples and milk were one of JonBenèt's all-time favorite snacks. She loved pineapples and milk, never tried it, maybe I should. Now, the only problem with this is that John and Patsy both claim that JonBenét did not have a bowl of pineapples and milk that night after they'd gotten home from the White's Christmas party. So they're not sure when she ate it or even who made the bowl of pineapples and milk for her. Since, according to them, they didn't make it for her and they weren't aware that she'd even eaten the bowl of pineapples and milk that night. Now, granted, JonBenét is 6 years old. At 6, both of my boys could make a bowl of cereal. I feel like cereal and milk and pineapples and milk can't be too far off. I'm sure she could have made it herself. But I also feel like that's something that they would have heard, like ruckus in the kitchen, cabinets opening, bowls, spoons, the works, But I don't know. Now, the Whites have been asked whether or not they served pineapple at their Christmas party, because that would explain it if she had eaten it there. But the Whites didn't remember having pineapple as a food option at this Christmas party. Although they would go on to say later that they may have served like a fruit cocktail, and that maybe that possibly had pineapple in it. But that's about all they could think of as to where she would have gotten this pineapple and milk from if it hadn't been given to her by John or Patsy. And the pineapple is such a big point of contention in this case because once the autopsy was done on JonBenét's body, it was found that the pineapple had been eaten pretty shortly before her death, just because of the amount of digestion that had happened, or the lack thereof digestion, I guess you could say. But then even that's kind of strange to me because the autopsy says that the pineapple wasn't very digested, which would suggest that she had eaten it shortly before her death. But then the autopsy also says that the pineapple and milk could have been eaten as early as 4 or 4:30 on December 26th, which would have been before the Ramseys ever even left their house to go to the White's Christmas party. So that timeline definitely changes things, and without a definitive time that the pineapple was eaten, it's hard to say either way when she would have eaten it. But once the bowl was collected and examined and processed, the only fingerprints that were found on this bowl belonged to Patsy Ramsey and JonBenét's 9-year-old brother, Burke Ramsey. Now, we know that the Ramseys had a housekeeper, so my question would kind of be, did Patsy put the dishes away after they were washed? Like, whether the housekeeper ran the dirty dishes through a dishwasher, or whether the housekeeper hand-washed the dishes and sat them in a dish strainer, would Patsy have been the one to have put them back in the cabinets and the drawers after the housekeeper was off duty? Because if so, then that would explain how Patsy's fingerprints got on the bowl with the pineapple and milk in it. But then how did Burke's fingerprints get on the bowl? Especially when no one in the house claims to have eaten pineapple that night after they'd gotten back from the Christmas party at the Whites. And like I've mentioned already, JonBenét was 6 years old, and that's old enough to wake up and make herself a snack. So even if John and Patsy didn't know that JonBenét had gotten up and made herself this bowl of pineapple and milk, that still doesn't explain why JonBenét's fingerprints aren't on the bowl too. And when John and Patsy were asked about the pineapple during an interview, Patsy said something that I never had heard before, and it kind of made my eyebrow go up, kind of like The Rock does his eyebrow, because Patsy said that from her understanding that the autopsy tech wasn't even 100% sure if this was actually even pineapple that was in JonBenét's digestive tract. And that got me thinking because I have heard for my entire life that this was for sure pineapple that was found in JonBenét's stomach, so I started digging. And Patsy is actually right. The way that the autopsy is worded, it basically says something to the effect of, there was a greenish yellow substance that was found that's believed to be a fruit or vegetable, possibly pineapple. And that was absolutely not a quote. I don't even have the autopsy report pulled up, so I'm just paraphrasing. But it does say something close to that. So I think that the pineapple has kind of gotten taken out of context just because there was a bowl of pineapple and milk that was found on the kitchen counter the morning that JonBenét was reported missing. Because again, the autopsy doesn't say that it is definitively 100% pineapple that is in her stomach. So maybe it was pineapple, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just something that JonBenét had eaten at the Christmas party that the Whites had thrown. And I just want to throw out the fact that I feel like it would be more likely for a kid to leave out a bowl of food that was sitting on the kitchen counter overnight. I feel like most adults would have emptied the bowl, rinsed it out, and then sat it in the kitchen sink if they didn't wash it immediately. But kids don't think that far ahead. So just the simple fact that the bowl was left sitting on the kitchen counter all night long with food, especially milk in it, that puts me in the mind of something that a kid would definitely do, and maybe not so much something that an adult would do, but I could very well be wrong. Not unless the entire Ramsey family was just so used to having a housekeeper that they just left things like that sitting out all the time, because there was normally a housekeeper there to kind of go behind them and pick up after them. But the housekeeper was off for Christmas, so maybe this was an adult who left the bowl of pineapple and milk out, and they only left it out because they were so used to having a housekeeper come right behind them and clean up their own messes. But I'm not sure. What do you think? Because I feel like the milk is what gets me. As an adult, you know that if you leave milk in a bowl overnight, it gets this like gross film around the inner like part of the bowl, and it's gross. Like, it almost makes you want to throw the entire bowl away. So I feel like this is more something that a kid would do. And the pineapple is such a big part of this case because it really depends on what you think happened and what this bowl of pineapple means to you. The bowl of pineapple and milk may be some kind of evidence for whatever you believe happened. The people who are in the camp that think that Burke Ramsey, who remember was only 9 years old at the time, but the people in Camp Burke did it, think that Burke was possibly in the kitchen having a midnight snack of pineapples and milk, and that maybe JonBenèt came down to the kitchen and maybe stole or snuck a piece of pineapple, just being like an annoying little sister. And that this piece of pineapple made Burke like flip out and murder his sister for whatever reason. But when Burke is asked about the pineapple later on, he also says that he didn't get up that night and make a bowl of pineapple and milk. So that means that according to everyone that is still living that lived in the Ramsey house, none of them made a bowl of pineapple and milk, and they don't know where it came from. And we'll get further into this theory later because it is just that, a theory. Because I really cannot see a world where an intruder comes in and makes a bowl of pineapple and milk, which also just so happens to be one of JonBenèt's favorite snacks, and then this intruder leaves the bowl on the countertop to go get JonBenèt, drag her to the basement, and murder her. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And then I want to kind of talk about this pineapple a little bit more before we get any further, because at one point, Patsy Ramsey does say during an interview that she doesn't even remember cutting the pineapple up, and that she doesn't remember buying a fresh pineapple. Because the pineapple that was found in the bowl with the milk was in fact a fresh pineapple. And if you've ever cut a fresh pineapple, then you know, like, it's no simple task. It's actually a pain in the ass to cut a fresh pineapple. Trust me, I love them, hate cutting them. And I've read a lot on online forums about this case, like Reddit, stuff like that. And a lot of people always kind of point to the fact that John and Patsy Ramsey seem to not remember a lot of things that happened. And I've been thinking about this all week. If I had a housekeeper and a nanny and a gardener and all of these other things, I would absolutely not be washing my own dishes. I would absolutely not be doing my own grocery shopping or my own laundry for that matter. And the Ramseys did have staff for all of these things. They had a nanny, they had a housekeeper, they had, a gardener, whatever. So if the nanny or the housekeeper or somebody like that did their grocery shopping, then of course Patsy Ramsey wouldn't remember buying a fresh pineapple because she wouldn't have bought it. It would have been a housekeeper or nanny. And if a nanny or housekeeper had been the one to cut the pineapple up and stick it in a storage bowl and put it in the fridge, then again, Patsy Ramsey wouldn't remember cutting a fresh pineapple. So I feel like that could explain some of the I don't remember this, I don't remember that. Because I probably wouldn't remember it either if my nanny or my housekeeper had done it. And one more important thing to keep in mind is that the medical examiner has never been able to confidently say that this organic matter in JonBenèt's digestive tract was 100% for sure, for certain pineapple. So, plot twist, think about this. What if it wasn't even pineapple that's in JonBenèt's stomach? And for all of these years, people have been so laser focused on the pineapple and what it means and who they think did it and why. And what if we've been wrong this entire time? Because maybe it's not even pineapple. I don't know, but that is definitely something to keep in mind when you start going through your own theories and what you think happened. Because this pineapple has always been such a huge part of this case, and then what if it was never even pineapple? And we'll talk more about the 2016 Dr. Phil interview with Burke Ramsey later on during this case. But I did want to mention that Dr. Phil did ask Burke during this interview if he and JonBenèt had eaten a snack of pineapples and milk that night or at any point during that day. And Burke just kind of answers this question in the same way that I feel like I would have answered. And he just says something along the lines of, it's possible, but do you think you'd remember eating pineapple 20 years ago? Which is a fair point. It's a fair point. So while we're on the topic of kitchen essentials that were found out and on the counter, there was also a drinking glass that was found on the counter. It was a clear, kind of see-through kind of glass. And this glass had Burke's fingerprints on it. But when the glass was swabbed for testing and for DNA, there was no saliva or DNA found on the rim of the glass. So it almost seems like someone took the glass out of the kitchen cabinet, made themselves a drink, and then didn't drink anything out of the glass. But then, of course, like everything else in this case, there's a double-edged sword, because when we talk about this glass, we also have to keep in mind the number of people that were walking around this house freely on the morning that JonBenèt was reported missing and before her body was found. Because the Whites and the Fernies were all there, along with a couple of police that were in and out, and then Linda Arndt, plus John and Patsy. And they were all in the Ramsey house that morning. They ate snacks, possibly made themselves something to drink, and they even cleaned up parts of the kitchen that they had used to make these snacks. And we've already talked about how badly this hurt the crime scene and the evidence, so I won't keep harping on it. But I am going to say that this could explain why the glass was out on the counter but never used. Because there were just so many people there in that house and so many things going on at once. So let's keep going with things that were found in the Ramseys' house that the Ramseys don't think were there the night before when they got back from the Christmas party at the White's house. Because there was also a huge Maglite flashlight found at the house, and I believe it was found on the kitchen counter. And it looks a lot like the flashlight that police carry on their belt. And at first, everyone was kind of asking the police officers that had been at the scene at any point during that day that JonBenèt's body was found. They had been asking the police if any of them were missing their flashlights. But all the officers had their flashlights, which makes this even harder because John and Patsy Ramsey claimed that that flashlight wasn't there before and that it had never been in their house before that morning. They'd never seen that flashlight before, and they did not know where it came from. So it's almost like, where the hell did this flashlight come from? Was it actually in the Ramsey house, and maybe they just didn't realize it? Because maybe it was in the basement or in a different room that the Ramseys didn't go in often inside of their house. Because maybe it's just me, but I have a closet in my house where random household objects go to die and never be seen again. If my kid were missing and someone came over to help me search my average size house, and maybe they open this closet where things go to die and they see this massive flashlight and they just grab it to help search. That could have possibly happened here at the Ramsey house. We already know that John and Patsy Ramsey had a few rooms in the basement that they didn't go into very often. Or at the very least, there were rooms in the basement that were used for just storage, and maybe somebody picked up a flashlight to use in the basement and they never put it back. And then maybe later on, when the police started asking where this flashlight came from or whose it was, the person who grabbed it either was already gone from the Ramsey house, or they were too afraid to speak up about it. Because the police wouldn't have been asking about this flashlight until after JonBenèt's body was found, and at that point, everybody's a suspect. Maybe if somebody did pick the flashlight up, they were too afraid to let police know that they had moved something in the house, which would have now been a crime scene after her body was found. I don't know, again, this is just me thinking out loud. Now, one thing that I purposely didn't mention earlier is that there was a suitcase found in one of the rooms in the basement. This suitcase wasn't in the same room that JonBenèt's body was found in, but it was in the basement. And both John and Patsy Ramsey have no idea where this suitcase came from. They claimed that it did not belong to them and that they'd never seen it before. Now, there's a retired detective that we're going to talk about a lot more as we get into this case. His name is Lou Smith. And Lou had a pretty impressive career. He worked on over 200 cases where he had gotten convictions. But Lou Smith had actually come out of retirement to try to help the Boulder Police Department in JonBenèt's case before he finally resigned. And Lou wouldn't make his resignation letter public, so we don't really know why he quit working with the Boulder Police Department, but he did eventually become sort of a private investigator for the Ramseys about JonBenèt's murder. And Lou Smith would go on to work with the Ramseys on JonBenèt's case for years and years, all the way up until he passed away in 2010. And out of all of the investigative work that Lou Smith did, he was fully convinced that an intruder had come into the Ramsey house and murdered JonBenèt. He did not believe that it was John, Patsy, or Burke Ramsey that were involved in any way in the murder of JonBenèt. And one of the things that he pointed to was this random-ass suitcase that was found in the basement. Lou believed that the intruder used the basement window that was already broken or unlocked to get inside of the Ramseys' basement. And then that the intruder used the suitcase in some way to help them get through the window and into the basement without being heard by the Ramseys who were sleeping upstairs. Now, this suitcase had a few things in it, like a children's book and a blanket. Now, once this blanket was tested, there was semen found on the blanket, and after DNA was taken and tested, the DNA came back to match one of John Ramsey's older sons from his first marriage. This older son was John Ramsey's son, who was also named John, but it was John Andrew. John Andrew had already been interviewed and ruled out as a suspect by Boulder police. John Andrew wasn't even in Colorado at the time of the murder, so that's kind of always stuck out to me. And not because I think that John Andrew is guilty or somehow involved, because obviously if he's been ruled out and his alibi's airtight, then it probably wasn't him. But I have always wondered if his semen was found on the blanket that was in the suitcase, then it's pretty likely that the suitcase had been in the basement for some time. Because how would an intruder get into the basement with a suitcase that just so happened to have a blanket with John Andrew's semen in it? This is where Lou Smith's intruder theory always loses me. Some parts of the intruder theory that Lou Smith brings are pretty valid, and some of them, like the suitcase, they just make absolutely no sense to me. Now, one way that it does make sense to me that John Andrew's semen was found on this blanket is to think about the fact that he was only 23 years old when JonBenèt was murdered. And John Andrew would visit with John and Patsy Ramsey. He would spend the night, and he possibly may have used that blanket as a means to clean up his, personal pleasure time. And then maybe he threw that blanket into an old suitcase that was already in the basement. And this is just me making an educated guess. This is in no way fact-based, I'm just saying. I can see how this semen was found on a blanket in an old suitcase that was in the basement in a room that wasn't gone into very often. That's all I'm saying. And then there's no way to know how long the semen had been on that blanket either. It could have been there for years and years and years before this suitcase was ever found during this murder investigation. And I'm sure somebody's going to comment about this. I know I keep calling it a blanket and it was actually a duvet, but in case you're white trash like me and have no idea what a duvet is, don't worry, I looked it up. It's essentially just a big-ass cover that you put your actual blanket or comforter inside of. So there we have it. And blanket is just so much easier for me to say. And one of the last things I want to mention that was found were JonBenèt's Long John style pants and her underwear that were found, and they were covered in her own urine. This is another big thing that people point to depending on who you think is responsible and what you believe happened. Because the people that are in the Patsy Did It camp, most of the Patsy Did It people believe that JonBenèt wet the bed that night on the 25th after they'd already gotten home from the Christmas party. Like, maybe JonBenèt woke Patsy up in the middle of the night to let her know that she'd wet the bed. Because JonBenèt did struggle with bedwetting. Which I feel like is a very normal thing for 6-year-old kids to do. They're still adjusting to holding their pee all night long. So, this is something that can get frustrating. And it's something that JonBenèt did struggle with. So the Patsy Did It people think that JonBenét woke Patsy up to let her mom know that she'd wet the bed again, and that this just sent Patsy into a fit of rage and she killed JonBenét accidentally for wetting the bed. A lot of times, the Patsy Did It people claim that Patsy was cleaning JonBenét up and she was getting really aggressive or rough with her. She hit her head on the bathtub, maybe accidentally, or maybe she was just being abusive and hit her too hard, and that's where the skull fracture comes from. We have no proof of that, but the Patsy Did It people think that these wet sleeper pants and these wet underwear prove their theory, which it doesn't. I can never imagine a parent getting so angry about their kid wetting the bed that they end up murdering their kid accidentally. And of course, with that being said, I'm well aware that kids are murdered by their parents every single day for sillier things than wetting the bed. But you also have to remember that the Ramseys did have a housekeeper, so it's not likely that Patsy would have been the one washing all these wet sheets and shit. And I'd be willing to bet that the Ramseys had plenty of 30,000 count thread sheets to replace one wet sheet. I don't know though, I'm just being sassy. Now, I know I kind of left you hanging last week on the interviews and such, but I wanted to go over some of the key items that were found in the house before we got too far into this case. So, like I said last week, John and Patsy did give their fingerprints and their hair and DNA to the police, and they did give kind of a brief short statement to the police on the day of the 26th when JonBenét's body was found. But then it was about 4 months later before they would agree to speak with police again. But all of the DNA that was tested against John, Patsy, and Burke's DNA, none of it matched the DNA that was found on JonBenét's body. So that seems like it should have kind of ruled the Ramseys out, but it didn't. Not for the court of public opinion and not for the Boulder Police Department. And again, like I've already mentioned before, the Ramseys did an interview with CNN on January 1st, 1997, and the interview with police wasn't done until April of 1997. So, shortly before John and Patsy Ramsey go on this CNN interview, Boulder Police had made a statement to the public to try to put everybody's mind at ease. The Boulder Police basically told everyone in the area not to worry because they thought that JonBenét's murder was an isolated incident. This wasn't something where police thought that there was some crazed psycho killer on the loose. Because just by the Boulder Police coming forward to the public and saying that they don't think there's a crazed killer on the loose, that sounds kind of like the police are basically saying like, we think we know who did this, we think we know who they are, we think we know where they are, and we're just waiting to gather enough evidence to be able to arrest them. Which to me kind of feels like a jab at the Ramseys, because if police didn't think it was the Ramseys, then they would have told the public that there was a killer out there on the loose. It kind of seems like the Boulder Police are kind of telling the Ramseys like, hey, we know it was you, and we're going to tell the public that too. But then, just shortly after that statement was made by the Boulder Police, John and Patsy Ramsey were on CNN telling everyone in America to hold their babies close to them because there was someone out there murdering children. Patsy even goes as far as to say if she could tell anyone in Boulder, Colorado one thing, that she would tell them to hold their babies close because there is a killer on the loose. And that is the literal complete opposite of what Boulder Police had just told people during their press conference. Patsy says during this CNN interview that she doesn't know if it was a man or a woman who's killing people, but that everyone needs to be aware, lock their doors, and stay vigilant. Now, what I think is so wild about this is the fact that during the first initial questioning of the Ramseys' neighbors and people in that area, there was absolutely nothing reported. But then, one of the neighbors that lived across the street from the Ramseys did come forward to let police know that they actually did hear something during the early morning hours of December 26th. Now, this neighbor claims to have heard a child's scream that stopped suddenly, followed by what sounded like metal being drug or scraped or hitting some other kind of metal. And all of this was heard sometime during the early morning hours on the 26th, during the same large time frame of when JonBenét was believed to have been murdered. And before I dug super deep into this case, I always wondered how this neighbor would have heard a child scream, but John and Patsy Ramsey didn't hear a thing from the top level of the same house where JonBenét was being murdered at. But then I dug a little bit deeper, And there was actually an experiment that was done to see if the neighbor across the street would have actually been able to hear a scream that also couldn't have been heard from the top floor of the house. And according to that experiment, there were actually vents that came from the basement and then led to the outside of the house. And because of those vents, the neighbor across the road would have been able to hear the screams, but that same experiment also showed that even though you could hear the screams from across the street, you could not hear the screams coming from the basement if you were on the top floor of the house. And the top floor of the house is where John and Patsy Ramsey's bedroom was. Their actual bedroom was the entire top floor of the house. So John and Patsy saying that they didn't hear anything could very well be true, and it even kind of checks out. Now, Lou Smith, who we've already talked about being one of the ones that ended up being the Ramseys' right-hand man, well, Lou Smith had a theory as to why this neighbor heard a scream that stopped pretty suddenly, followed by the sounds of metal. And Lou believes that the child's scream were obviously from JonBenèt, and that the noises of metal being hit against or drug across other metal was possibly the intruder removing a window grate to be sure that they had an exit route. And a window grate is just a metal covering that goes over most windows that are in basements, especially if the basement is mostly underground except for the top ceiling section of the basement. That's not the only experiment that was done, though, because later on during the investigation, detectives and investigators all kind of tested the theory of John Ramsey being able to see the white blanket in the wine cellar without the lights being on. And none of the investigators or detectives could see a white blanket in the wine cellar without the lights being turned on first. Even though John Ramsey is adamant that he could absolutely see the white blanket without the light switch being flipped on first. So that's interesting to say the least. This handful of people can absolutely not see it, while this one man says he absolutely can. Could this be because it's John Ramsey's house and he knows what's supposed to go where, and this blanket's not usually in that floor in the wine cellar? Possibly. But I still think it's interesting. Now, eventually, John and Patsy were finally interviewed, and all of their wild-ass, crazy-ass demands were met. They were allowed to be interviewed together and in the same room, which is typically a big no-no for obvious reasons. They were also given their transcripts from any previous statements that they'd given to police, and they basically got everything that they demanded. Now, John and Patsy were finally interviewed, and it was the same old thing that they'd already said, probably because they had their transcripts from their first interview to go off of, but that's just my guess. And Burke Ramsey was also questioned once by a child psychologist shortly after JonBenèt's death. And I'm going to play some pieces of that interview here for you next week, because I'm all out of time. These kids got me all the way messed up. We had a 2-hour delay from school today, which put me so far behind on the podcast. So, we will talk about the interview with Burke next week and so many other things, because this interview with Burke is hella weird. He was a child, but it's still hella weird. So, before we do the review of the week, I just want to say thank you to everybody that did what I asked. If you've listened to at least 3 episodes and you like the podcast, just leave a 5-star review somewhere. Spotify, Apple, Audible, anywhere. And I've had so many new reviews, it's insane. So I want to pull one of those right quick, and then I'm going to sign off. This review comes from Chelsea4889, and the caption says, "You rock, 5 stars. The rest of the review says, "This is the second podcast I've ever found that I actually thoroughly enjoyed. I have been caught up and absolutely cannot wait for more. I love the way she breaks down every last detail and sometimes leaves us hanging on cliffhangers. Please, 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 never stop doing podcast. Much love from Minnesota." Girl, I got you. You're my best friend right now. Thank you so much. That was so freaking nice, and I cannot wait to get into this interview next week. So, let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.